Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and in this training video we'll look at recreating this fantastic exploding planet using NeXus constraints and some other fused tools. So let's get started. So here we are in Cinema 4D and we have a default sphere primitive in our scene. First of all, we're going to get this sorted out. So we want to increase the segments. Let's change the type first. We are going to use something with some nice even topology. So we're going to go to our type and change it from standard to icosahedron. And then let's give this more segments, maybe 100. Okay, now we can hit NA to hide those lines. Now we're going to emit particles from this sphere. That's the effect. So we go to INSYDIUM, we're going to bring in an xparticles system, and let's call this system, we'll go to the basic tab and we'll call it system motion. These are going to be the moving particles. Now by default we already get an emitter brought into our scene here, and it's actually in the sphere. If we pull this out, there's our emitter, hit play, we're firing out these particles. We want to emit from the sphere though, so let's go to the emitter object tab and we're going to change the emitter shape from rectangle to object, and then we want to drag in the object we want to emit from into here, look. So let's get our sphere, drag it in. Now by default it's emitting from the polygon center, and we've got quite a lot of speed and it's just spitting these out all the time. So let's just change that. We'll go to the emission tab and we'll change the particle speed. We'll actually just put it on 0 for now, and then let's leave it as is. And if we hit play, let's just increase that rate up to say 10,000 per second. And now you can see that we're getting particles being born in the polygon center of our sphere. So what we're going to do actually at the moment, by default, I've got a birth rate of 10,000. What does 10,000 mean? Well, if I pull this birth rate arrow down, you can see, look, we've got some extra settings, and it's saying it is birthing 10,000 particles per second. So every 30 frames, it will have birthed 10,000 particles. I like to know exactly how many particles are being emitted per frame. It's just the way I work. It's personal preference. So I'm going to change this to per frame. So now we have got 30 times the particles being born because we've got 10,000 per frame. So now I can put this down. Just going to put it down to the default of 1,000. And again, it's personal preference. I always like to work in per frames so I know exactly how many particles are getting born when. So there we go, we've got our particles being born on our sphere, and they're being born in the polygon center, which is not what we want. We want these to be kind of emitted in a cool kind of random, almost stripy pattern. So the way we'll do that is using a texture. So let's build that texture first. We'll just switch off the emitter. We're going to go to the material manager and we're going to make a new Cinema 4D material, double click. We'll double click on this. Well, actually, look, let's put it on the sphere. So now this material's on the sphere. We'll double click on it to get the settings. And in the color channel, but at the moment it's just this color. So if we put, say, a green, the sphere goes green, obviously. But we want to use a noise texture. So let's go to this texture pull down and click on noise. And now look, we've got this noise being mapped to our sphere. Now we want to make some adjustments to this noise. Let's go to the thumbnail of the noise and click. I will change it from the default noise to, let's go with a stupel, which gives us this really nice detailed swirly looking noise. Let's just increase the octaves to 10. And what we'll do is make a couple of changes. We want this to be bigger, let's say, I don't know, 230. And what we want to do is, instead of this being these kind of swirls, we want them to be stretched out horizontally. So look, let's stretch out the horizontal axis, the x-axis, right? That's stretched that. And then let's squash them on the y. So to do that, we'll reduce the scale of the y-axis, the up and down axis. And look, it's squashing it up. That's kind of more of what we want. So now what we want to do is we want to make the darkers darker and the lighters lighter. So we want to kind of add contrast to this. It's too grey at the moment. So we can increase this low clip here, which is going to crush the blacks way up. Look at that. Excellent. Let's move it even higher up, something like that. Let's reduce the high clip to lighten up those lights that are remaining. So something like that is looking pretty cool. And now we have got these kind of stretched out stripes, which is what we're going to emit from. That's looking pretty good. Now, if you want to, you can cycle through these seeds, look, and we'll get different looks. Just keep going till you get one you like. That one's pretty cool. Let's stick with that. Okay, so that'll do for now. We'll close that down, and we'll close down our material manager. So we want to emit particles from these light bits of this texture. How do we do that? Well, let's go to our emitter. We'll go back to the first frame. We'll switch the emitter on. And what we'll do in the emitter object tab, we're going to, instead of, at the moment, look, we're emitting from the sphere, but it's emitting from the polygon center. Let's change that to, look, we've got texture. Click on texture. And when we did that, this new texture tab has appeared. This wasn't here before. So let's click on this. And it's saying, which texture tag do you want to emit from? Well, we want to reference this one on the sphere. So let's drag it in. And by default, it's saying it's going to only emit particles from the lighter parts of the color channel. And it's also going to color those particles based on that color channel as well. So we're going to get some whites and grays. So if this is working, if we hit play, we should only be getting particles there. Now, it looks like it's kind of working. We've got these particles, look, and they're being colored correctly, but they seem out of position. They're not synced up. And that's because we are using this primitive object, and our material is set to UVW mapping, but we don't actually have UV coordinates. So what we need to do is just change this to spherical mapping, which is going to look exactly the same in our viewport, but it means that our emission is going to line up perfectly now. So now if we hit play, yes, we've got particles. Let's make the sphere invisible. We've got particles just being emitted just as part of that texture. Perfect. So now that we have got that sorted, we're kind of getting there. We've got our particles emitting in the right place. Now we need to animate our sphere, because we need our sphere to spin round, and then we want our particles to emit only when it's spinning at its fastest. So that's what we'll get set up now. So what we'll do is very simple. Let's just add a few more frames on our timeline. We're going to put this up to 200 frames, and we're going to go to our sphere coordinates, and what we're going to do is animate it, the rotation on the heading. And if I just move this, you'll see that that's spinning it around on that y-axis there. So that's the animation that we want, spin round. So let's put that back down to 0. On frame 0, we're going to put a keyframe here. Then at about, say, frame 60, we're going to maybe have it spin 180 degrees, put a keyframe, and then another 60-ish frames along, frame 120. We want a little bit of residual rotation, so maybe up to 220 degrees. And if we hit play, what we have got is a bit of spin, slows down, comes to a stop. So now we want to kind of ramp up this. So it starts spinning much slower and then goes and spins really fast just in this short amount of time. So how might we do that? Well, we can change the curve that is interpolating between these keyframes, which is actually dead easy and very intuitive. The way we do it, we need to look at the timeline. So if you see my mouse, follow it down to the left. We're going to click on this button here, which opens our timeline. Let's give ourselves a bit more room. Now, by default, we're in this sheet, which is the dope sheet, and we can see our sphere here, and we can see that, look, the sphere contains keyframes. If we pull down, we'll see which parameters have been keyframed. Okay, so it's a rotation parameter. We can come down again, and look, we have keyframes on the heading. And if we hit H, it frames them so we see all of the keyframes. And so there's our first keyframe, second keyframe, third keyframe. We want to change the curve though. So to do that, we want to change from dope sheet to F curve mode. Let's click on that. And now look, we can see that F curve. And what we want to do is adjust this. So on our first keyframe, we want to pull this out. And what this is saying is, hardly any rotation, hardly any rotation, hardly any rotation, and then rotate fast, 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 fast. Excellent. Let's get our second one, and we could perhaps just pull this in a bit. And something like that. So now if we just close that down by clicking on this button, what we have done by changing that curve is, look, slow rotation, fast rotation, and then it slows down. And it's at that fast bit, that's where we're going to whip off those particles. Excellent. So that is perfect. Now we have got that rotation. This is looking pretty cool. So let's bring back our emitter in. Now, at the moment, our particles are being emitted from that texture, but they're just static. They have no speed, so they don't care about what the sphere is doing. However, if we go to our XP emitter, to the emission tab, and we go to this motion inheritance tab, we can inherit the motion from the source object. So we can inherit this rotation motion. So look, let's click on use motion inheritance. Now the sphere isn't moving in a linear direction. It hasn't got any up, down, left, right animation. So we can actually just switch that one off. But it does have rotational direction. So this is the one we want. And if we hit play, you'll see that as it spins, look, the particles inherit that speed and they fly off. So that's the basic look that we want. Now we need to set this up to make it emit in a more sophisticated way. And we're going to do that by taking this sphere, and we're going to farm some data from this sphere. We're going to extract out the rotation velocity, how quick it's rotating, and we're going to feed that into the emitter, so it only emits when the sphere is spinning at its fastest. And to do that, we're going to have to use a bit of Xpresso. Now, if you've used Xpresso before and you're comfortable with it, this will be a very simple setup for you. If you haven't used Xpresso before, it may seem a bit confusing and intimidating at first, but we'll go through it step by step, and by the end you'll understand how it is working. So what we're going to do on our sphere, we're going to go to tags, and we're going to go to programming tags, and we're going to bring in an Xpresso tag. This brings an Xpresso tag onto our sphere here, and it automatically opens up this Xpresso node editor. So what we want to do is we want to take information from the sphere and stick it into the emitter. So we need to drag in the sphere, which creates a node of that sphere, and we want to drag in our emitter, which creates a node of the emitter. If I hit Control and hold it and double click, it'll resize it to fit in all of that text. So the outputs, the data that we can take out of the sphere, we have to look at the red bits because it's coming out. And look, this is all of the data that the sphere holds here. And look, we could take out the color, we could take out the, look, the radius, all of this data is contained within that sphere. And if we come down, look, we can take out the rotation velocity, how quick it's spinning. So let's click that, and look, it's made this little port that I can pull a line out of. So let's hold Control, double click, and look, rotation velocity. So what we want to do is take this velocity and feed it into the emitter. So what we could do is go to our emitter. Now we want to put it into the emitter, and putting it in an input is the blue side. And look, these are all of the settings in the emitter that can be driven by data. So look, if we go to the emission tab, birth rate, we can select that. And that birth rate is exactly the same as what it is if we go to our emitter, emission tab, it's just this birth rate setting. This is what we're going to be controlling. So without even seeing what this number is that's coming out of here, this rotation velocity, it'll actually be a vector, but it doesn't matter, you don't need to know that. If we just plug this straight into the birth rate without doing anything else, let's see if we get anything. So now the birth rate is being controlled not by, in the emitter, this number. Look, if I try and put this up, it just snaps back to 0 because we're no longer controlling it. This little icon is telling you that the Xpresso rig is controlling it. If we hit play, let's see what happens. No particles. Ah, look, we've got a few particles when it's spinning at its fastest. So it's definitely doing something. But we, at the moment, have got no way of manipulating this. We want to have loads more particles in the scene. So let's bring our graph back in. So what we need to do is take this data and we need to manipulate it so we can add more particles. So the way we're going to do this, there's lots of different ways you can do this, and you could actually make a very complex, sophisticated rig here using loads of nodes, which will give you ultimate control. But we're just going to make a very basic one that's going to work for our scene. And we're going to do it with what's called a range mapper node, which is really powerful. So we'll right click, we're going to go new node, Xpresso, and we're going to bring in a calculate node, and here is our range mapper. So let's click it, and here it comes. So now what we want to do is, we want the rotation velocity to go into this range mapper, and then the range mapper, what comes out of this, that's what we want to go into our birth rate of our emitter. And if we go into our range mapper, we can go into the attributes manager, and here are all the settings for our range mapper. Now what we want to do is, we're going to change this input. Look, we've got an input lower and an input upper, output lower, output upper. Now this may all seem a bit confusing at first, but you'll get it in a second. We're going to change these lower numbers, the input numbers, into degrees per second, how quickly it's spinning. So to do that, look, the input range, we're going to change it from user defined to degrees. So now we've got that. Brilliant. So what this is saying now is, the lowest amount will be when the sphere is spinning 0 degrees per second, it will be emitting 0 particles. When it is spinning at 360 degrees per second, it will be emitting 1 particle per frame. So let's have a look at what that gives us. Take that off, we'll hit play, and we've got hardly any particles. All right, so let's move this out. So let's change that. Let's say when it is 0 degrees, it has 0 particles, yes, but when it's spinning at 360 degrees per second or more, we want to emit loads more particles. Let's put 1,000. Okay, we'll move that, hit play. And so we shouldn't get any particles when it's not spinning. Yes, and now that's working better. The problem is, this is emitting particles when it's spinning really slowly, and we don't want that. So let's go back to our range mapper, and instead, look, the input lower, let's increase it to say 100 degrees per second. So now what it's saying is, if it's spinning at 100 degrees per second or lower, it'll be emitting 0 particles. If it's the upper hasn't changed, the 360 degrees per second, it'll be emitting 1,000 particles per second. Okay, so let's have a play. So now it's spinning. Look, it's spinning and we're getting no particles because it's under that 100 degrees per second, and then we're getting that. Cool. I think we could go even higher on this. Let's say 160 degrees per second is the lowest it can be before it starts emitting. So now it's spinning, and there we go. So that's pretty cool. So we can adjust this and tweak this until we have got that precise look that we want. Maybe going to go down to 150. Excellent. So now we have our rig, really. Now if I just double click on my Xpresso again to bring up this, now we could make this much more sophisticated. Now when we want to make adjustments to how many particles are being emitted, we have to come into our range mapper node and adjust this outer output upper amount. That's going to work for us in this scene. We're going to keep it at that and keep it simple. But if you're comfortable Xpresso, you can set up your own user data with sliders and multiply nodes and all kinds of stuff to make it more sophisticated. But for us, this is going to work. Brilliant. So let's just put this up to a big amount. Let's say 30,000. So now we've got loads of particles being emitted at that point. Really cool. Let's move back a bit. Excellent. So now we have got that set up, what we need to do is start thinking about how we can get these particles to act a little bit more realistically and interact with each other. At the moment, they're just spitting out from that texture when the sphere is spinning at its fastest. So we're going to add a little bit of physics to this. And that's what we'll look at now. So what we're going to do first of all is let's go to our NeXus. We're going to do this on the GPU for the most part. So we'll go to our NeXus menu in our system, and we're going to go to our choose objects, and we're going to bring in and NX drag. Now this is going to simulate drag on these particles as they move through the air or move through whatever volume of liquid or gas they're moving through. So they'll slow down over time basically. So drag has got a few settings which are driven by the settings in the modifier, but also some of the settings in the emitter as well, which I'll show you in a sec. So first of all, we can set the density of the gas or the liquid that they're moving through. So if we change this from air to something more dense like water, the effects of drag is going to be more pronounced. And look, you're going to see them slowing down loads. Look at that, they can hardly move. So let's reduce the strength multiplier down a little bit to say 50%. Now we've got 50% drag. And you'll see they're still being affected quite badly, way too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our XP emitter, to the emission tab, because we've just got, if we come down to our basic particle data, we've got the radius just on the default radius of 3 centimeters. Now the radius of a particle affects its drag, because in the real world, an object which has a greater surface area than another, drag will have a greater effect on it. It'll slow down more. And in the calculation of NX drag, it uses radius to work out that surface area. So smaller particles don't get dragged down as much. If we put this on 1 and hit play, you'll see that they'll move way more easily and that drag has less of an effect. Okay. So what we'll do with this is, look, let's put these particles, let's give them maybe a radius of 2.5 and a variation of 1. So now we've got a slight variation. The drag's going to be changing per particle. We've got something like that. It's still a little, arguably would say that's a little too strong. So we could either reduce the radius down a bit, or we could make some tweaks within the drag object itself. Let's put the radius down to 2, and let's just put a variation of 0.5. So now we've got that, and that's looking pretty cool. Let's just dolly in. Nice, that's looking good. Okay. So now we've got that. As we're working on it, actually, let's just go to our Xpresso rig, and we're just going to go to our range mapper node. Let's just reduce the amount of particles that we're playing with at the moment, because we're going to start adding loads more solvers in here. So we may as well keep this a bit lighter in the viewport. We're also going to go to our emitter display tab, and we're going to change the editor display from the default squares to dots, so they're a bit smaller in our scene. There we go. So that's looking pretty cool, isn't it? There's our particles all flying out. So now what we want to do is we are going to go to our NeXus menu, and we're going to get our particles to start interacting with each other. At the moment, they're just kind of independent entities. And to do that, we are going to go to nxConstraints. Now, the constraints that we're going to use, we're not going to use connections. They're like springs between particles. We're going to use particle-to-particle friction. Let's bring this in. Now, by default, what this is saying is there's a friction of 80%, and what it is saying is any one particle will have a friction force applied to up to 16 other particles if they are within a 30 centimeter radius of each other. Now, this is quite a big radius, which means that we're going to have almost millions of calculations going on here, which is going to be very intensive on the GPU. If we reduce the radius down, there's going to be far fewer calculations. It gives a different look, but we'll start with a lower radius. Let's put our connection limit down as well, so they can only affect fewer particles. This is going to make it a little bit quicker to simulate, and we can always bump these settings up should we need to near cache time. But now look, we're starting to get this really cool clumping of these particles, and we've pretty much got the effect already sorted there. So let's go back to the first frame, hit play, and there is our look. That's looking excellent. And we're almost there. All we need to do is make some tweaks to add a little bit more detail. So what we can do now is add another emitter, which is going to have larger chunks with fewer particles, and you'll see the detail that this emitter is going to add. So let's go back to the first frame, and what we'll do is we'll get this emitter and duplicate it. Let's hold Control, copy it, drag it down, and now we've got 2 emitters. This one, let's go to the basic tab and call it emitter big, and we'll switch off that original emitter for now. Switch it off, and in our new one, let's go to our display tab. We are going to display these as squares, and in the emission tab everything can remain exactly the same, but we need to hook this up to our Xpresso rig, remember, because we want these to be emitting at the right time. So let's go to our Xpresso nodes, and all we need to do is, look, let's drag in our new emitter. Let's hit Control, double click, there's emitter big. Let's pinch our range mapper. Now we don't want this to have exactly the same settings, so I can't just take this output again because I want fewer particles with this one. But what we can do is hold Control, drag down this node, let go, and it makes a copy. We need to get the same input from that rotation velocity. We can output this to, let's go to the blue one, drop it on, and then pick emission, birth rate. But we want to change in this range mapper, we want way fewer particles. Let's put this down to maybe just 500. Okay, now we can close that up. And now if we hit play, we should have some fewer, bigger particles. Yes, very cool. So these are just going to add a really nice bit of detail. If we go to our emitter original and stick that on, and then simulate these together, very nice. That's looking really cool already. So we're going to just add a little bit of a tweak here before we move on to the next particle. So this one, we're going to take this emitter and this emitter. So we're going to change 2 settings at the same time. We're going to go to the emission, and let's just add 1 speed with a tiny bit of variation. And this is just going to give them a little bit of their own emission speed on birth, and it'll just break up a bit. This is already looking brilliant. So we're virtually there with the look that we want. Let's just add, let's add 1 more emitter. So we'll take our, and these ones are going to be small particles as well. So I'm going to copy the first one, hold Control, drag it down, and then this one, we're going to call it emitter detail. And in this one, we're going to, again, we need to add it to our Xpresso rig. So let's double click on that, and we'll do the same thing. We'll drag in our emitter detail, Control, double click, and we'll copy our range mapper, and we'll drag the input into there, output into the blue, emission, birth rate. And then in the range mapper, we don't want as many as we have in our first one, which is 15,000 in the upper. We want way more than this. Let's just try maybe 5,000. And we're going to make one more change. We're going to display these ones as tiny dots, but we're going to give them a bigger radius, which means that they're going to be affected by the drag more, and it's going to really fill out some of these gaps. So in the emitter detail, let's go to the emission tab, and let's change this radius up to 4, and we put the variation to 1. And these are going to be really severely affected by the drag. So let's have a look. And you can see this is slowing down now because our constraints are doing so much work. But there we've got this fantastic look as those particles are being flung off this sphere. And because our texture is procedural, we can change the look should we wish. If we go to our material manager, let's come into this texture and go into our noise. We can just change the seed look. So let's just try a different seed. We could try a different noise if you wanted to, something like that. We could crush that high up so there's even less white, something like that. Then give it a play, and then we're getting more kind of stripes coming off. So it's entirely up to you. So that's looking great. So let's close down that material. So that's our basic animation and physics working. There's just one more step that'll be important, not now, but when you want to render your particles it'll be an important step for then. So that's what we'll set up now. So what we want to do is on our big particles, let's just switch off the other two. So we've just got visible our big particles, which we're displaying as squares. Now, when it comes to render time, you're going to want to render these bigger ones, and you're going to instance some kind of chunks of kind of rock. And the problem is at the moment is that these particles have no kind of rotation, they're just firing out. So let's just view them in a way which means that we can look at the rotation of the particles. If we go to the display tab, we'll change it from squares to boxes filled. Now if we hit play, you'll see that, look, there's no rotation at all, they're just all firing out. And if we're instancing bits of rock for these at render time, it's going to look a bit weird them having no kind of rotation at all. So let's just get that set up. We'll go to our, in fact we could put this in on all of them. Let's make them all active. We'll go to every emitter and we'll go to the extended data tab. We'll go to use rotation, click it on. And what we will do is we'll go to simple spin, and we're just going to add, look, we don't need much, 1 degree of spin, but then with 1 degree of variation on each axis. And now you'll see, let's just switch off the small two again so we don't see them. Now we'll see that these have a little bit of spin as they're coming off, and that's going to look way better. Okay. Very nice. Now, the last thing that we need to do actually is, do you remember that when we were discussing the drag, we said that the particle radius plays a part in how much the drag affects the particles. Bigger particles are dragged down more strongly than smaller particles. Well, if we go to our emitters, all of these emitters, if we go to the emission tab, we have put a little bit of variation in the radius of our particles, but this has just been applied randomly across the particles from that emitter. What we want to do is be a bit more precise, and we can do that on all of them. Let's select all emitters. We'll go to the object tab, and what we want to do is go back to that texture tag. This is how we did the texture emission. And remember, we were getting them to emit from the color channel, so only from the lighter parts. We're coloring them from the color channel of that material. But look, we can drive that difference in radius using the color channel as well. So the whiter parts will have the maximum radius set within our range. The darker grays will have a smaller particle. And that is going to change the way in which the drag affects these particles. And it's going to mean that we're going to get a bit more of a coherent look with the lighter particles slowing down more quickly than the darker. And we can see that happening. Look, the darker ones are being less affected by the drag. So that's pretty cool. So then if we activate all our other emitters, which are all doing that now, and hit play, you'll see that we get a slightly different clumping. And in fact, what we need to do is go to our emitter big and stop viewing them as boxes filled. Let's go back to squares, and look, we can just force display, which means it happens straight away. Carry on simming, and there we go. And it's a little change, but it's just made it a little bit more coherent. And because the drag is affecting particles with the same color, we're getting more of these cool clumps which are coming off. And the last thing we're going to address is, I just feel like we've got a little bit too much of these, look like they're being affected by drag too much. We've got this almost halo of particles that aren't moving. So we could either reduce the drag, or we could go to our emitter detail, emission tab. These are our bigger particles. Let's just reduce this down so they don't have quite as large a radius. Let's put that down to 3. And now we're not going to have as bigger particles, and so they're not going to be as affected by the drag. And yeah, that's looking way better. Okay, so that's it. A brilliant look. That is the basic physics sim that we are going for. And that is the end of this part. In the next part, we're going to be adding some detailed particles to this sphere, which are going to add an incredible amount of detail to the sim and really sell the shot.